He came to ruin her bakery, but discovered the truth instead. Elodie had always loved the small bakery her grandfather founded in the heart of Provence. Every morning, the narrow streets filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and blooming lavender seemed to welcome her personally. The soft light of dawn spilled through the windows, illuminating the worn wooden counters, the shelves lined with jars of preserves, and the faded photographs of her grandfather kneading dough. She moved with quiet determination, weighing flour with care, folding delicate pastries, and arranging loaves with meticulous precision. Every gesture was a tribute to tradition, every loaf an act of devotion. Elodie believed in simple truths, the integrity of ingredients, the honesty of work, and the unwavering loyalty of her community. The world outside was changing rapidly, but within these walls, time seemed to pause, honoring the legacy of generations. The bakery was more than a business. It was the heartbeat of the town, a living clock that synchronized the lives of its inhabitants. Locals stopped by not only for the warm croissants or crusty baguettes, but also for the comforting presence of someone who knew them, remembered their stories, and shared in their daily lives. Children pressed their faces against the glass display to marvel at the colorful pastries, their eyes wide with wonder, while elderly women debated the perfect tart, their voices a familiar hum in the warm air. Travelers who stumbled upon the shop were instantly drawn in by the alluring aroma and the welcoming smile of Elodie, a young woman who carried a century of history on her shoulders with a quiet, unassuming grace. She was the guardian of a sanctuary where the outside world's noise was replaced by the comforting crackle of a cooling crust. Elodie interacted with each person as if they were part of her extended family, and the town, in turn, protected her bakery as if it were a sacred place. Meanwhile, far across the Atlantic, Richard sat in his sleek New York apartment, eyes scanning emails with habitual cynicism. The city outside never slept, its jagged skyline a constant reminder of the competition that fueled his career. He had become a successful food critic, his words shaping the reputations of restaurants and chefs alike with a single, calculated stroke of his keyboard. He was accustomed to luxury. Penthouse views, Michelin-starred meals, and invitations to the most exclusive culinary events, where his presence was both craved and feared. Yet, for all his success, a sense of detachment lingered, a quiet bitterness from years spent evaluating and judging rather than creating and nurturing. This cynicism had become his armor, protecting him from the passion he had long ago abandoned in favor of influence. His career thrived on critique, and he had long grown comfortable with the notion that truth was flexible if it served the story he wanted to tell. That morning, a particular email caught his attention, marked with a priority flag that mirrored the cold ambition of its sender. An exclusive file awaited him, sent by Mr. DuPont, a powerful developer with interests scattered across continents and a reputation for flattening history to make room for glass and steel. The message was straightforward. Investigate a small bakery in Provence, expose the dirty secrets hidden behind its charming facade, and provide the narrative foundation for a story that would both enthrall and scandalize his global readership. Attached were documents, staged photographs, and reports detailing supposed violations, claims of unhygienic practices, and financial mismanagement that seemed almost too perfect in their depravity. Richard skimmed them quickly, his skepticism muffled by the promise of a career-defining exposé. He felt a familiar, sharp rush, the thrill of a big story, the chance to write with devastating authority, and the opportunity to influence the culinary world from his high-rise perch. He planned a brief, clinical trip to the quaint town, intending only to take a few calculated pictures, verify the sordid details for dramatic effect, and return to his Manhattan office to finalize a piece that would seal the bakery's fate. On the train to Provence, the rolling landscape offered a stark contrast to the sterile reports in Richard's bag, the vibrant greens of the countryside blurring past his window like a world he no longer understood. Though he felt a flicker of professional curiosity, he remained anchored to his cynical objective, to verify the documents just enough to craft the narrative Mr. DuPont required for his high-end development project. He was here to execute a story, not to discover a truth that might complicate his paycheck or his status in the Manhattan elite. His mind was already composing the opening lines of a tragedy, a sharp-edged critique that would strip the town of its innocence for the sake of a headline. He checked the digital copies of the dirty photos one last time, his conscience buried under the weight of professional obligation and the cold promise of continued influence. Arriving in the town, he navigated the narrow streets with practiced indifference, his camera slung casually around his neck like a weapon ready to be drawn. The bakery was easy to spot, a modest building with weathered wooden shutters and a small, hand-painted sign that read Boulangerie de la Famille, a relic of a time he considered obsolete. He expected grime, the visible neglect of a dying business, and perhaps the sour, unpleasant odor of overworked ovens and poor hygiene described in DuPont's files. Instead, he was met with a jarring, inconvenient perfection. The windows gleamed with a clarity that defied his narrative, the stone counters were spotless, and the smell of freshly baked croissants, warm sourdough, and delicate lavender-infused pastries wrapped around him like a welcoming, undeniable embrace. Curiosity momentarily overcame his calculated skepticism. He stepped inside, the bell chiming a soft, silver note, and Elodie looked up from kneading a heavy mound of dough, her hands dusted with a fine white powder and her eyes bright, alert, and entirely devoid of the deceit his documents promised. "Bonjour," she said, her voice carrying a melody that seemed to echo the charm of the town itself. "Would you like to try something special?" Richard nodded, momentarily caught off guard by her presence and the harmony of the bakery. She offered him a croissant, golden and flaky, the aroma intoxicating. He took a bite, and for the first time in years, his judgments faltered. Flavors exploded with clarity and precision, each ingredient distinct, yet perfectly balanced. This was no ordinary pastry. This was craft, care, and passion embodied in dough and butter. His preconceived notions began to crumble. The reports, the photographs, they did not match this reality. Elodie spoke of her ingredients with pride. Butter from a local creamery, flour milled in a neighboring village, fruits picked at the peak of ripeness. She described her grandfather's methods, the care he had taken to build a bakery not just for profit, but for people. Richard listened, half skeptical, half enchanted. The bakery was alive, vibrant, and real, unlike the sterile documents he had received. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Richard realized that his assignment was no longer straightforward. The world he had expected to document with cynicism had revealed its humanity, its texture, and its complexity. He faced a choice, though he did not yet understand the full weight. Follow the path laid out by powerful interests, or seek a deeper truth that might cost him professionally. Richard's stay in the town extended beyond his initial itinerary, not because of a mechanical breakdown, but due to a growing, uneasy fascination with the world he was tasked to destroy. When Elodie noticed him lingering near the bakery after closing time, she offered to show him the village, sensing a quiet curiosity behind his defensive posture. Richard accepted, realizing that to effectively critique, or eventually defend, this place, he needed to see it through the eyes of the woman who was its soul, even as the dossier in his bag felt heavier with every step. Their days became a series of quiet adventures through a landscape that refused to fit into his preconceived boxes. Early mornings brought visits to local farmers' markets where stalls overflowed with vegetables, fruits, cheeses, and fragrant herbs, each exchange a testament to a chain of trust that DuPont's reports had labeled mismanagement. Elodie introduced Richard to each vendor with a familiarity that bridged generations, explaining how the butter from a local creamery and the flour milled in a neighboring village formed the bedrock of her craft. Richard observed carefully, his professional instincts now warring with a mounting, inconvenient respect for this ecosystem of shared labor. In the afternoons, they walked through fields of lavender, the sun low and golden, as Elodie spoke of her grandfather's legacy not as a burden of the past, but as a living responsibility to the future. Richard listened, his cynicism eroding as he watched the community's genuine fondness for her, realizing that the narrative of unhygienic decay he had intended to write was not just a mistake, but a calculated, cruel distortion of a vibrant reality. The quiet of the evenings offered a different perspective. Richard watched Elodie in the back of the bakery, her movements a rhythmic dance of tradition. Each loaf, shaped by her flour-dusted hands, felt like a silent rebuttal to the dossier in his pocket. He began to see the bakery not as a business to be audited, but as a living legacy, making the deception he was part of feel increasingly like a personal betrayal. She spoke less in these moments, letting her craft demonstrate her integrity. Richard felt a twinge of guilt, realizing that the exposé he had intended to produce would have been an attack on this dedication, this purity of purpose. He considered calling his editor to cancel the story, but hesitated, aware of the potential consequences. Contracts, professional reputation, and the powerful influence of Mr. Dupont loomed over him like a shadow. As the days passed, the growing tension inside him became more pronounced. Each croissant he tasted, each loaf he watched Elodie prepare, was a reminder of the stark contrast between truth and the false narrative he had been handed. He tried to reconcile his professional obligations with his emerging conscience. His notes began to change from critical observations to detailed accounts of the care, the authenticity, and the human effort he witnessed. Every word written felt like an act of defiance against the misleading documents he had trusted. Mr. Dupont, far away in his luxurious office, began to notice the delay with the cold impatience of a man used to buying time. Calls were made, subtle threats delivered through the editor, who insisted that deadlines were binding and that Richard's hesitation was unprofessional, a stain on his carefully curated reputation. Dupont's plan was simple and ruthless. A new glass and steel shopping center would replace the bakery, and Richard's article would be the surgical instrument used to justify the demolition in the name of modernization and safety. The stakes became agonizingly clear. Richard was caught between a distorted loyalty to the power structures that funded his lifestyle and a mounting, undeniable pressure from a conscience he thought he had buried in Manhattan. His internal conflict intensified, emotions twisting between the fear of professional exile and a reluctant, deep-seated admiration for Elodie, who remained unaware of the commercial storm gathering around her sanctuary. Every croissant he tasted, every conversation he recorded for his research, felt like a weight added to a scale that was slowly tipping toward a truth that would cost him everything. Every decision carried the weight of a life's work, and the lines between his obligation to a paycheck and his loyalty to the truth blurred under the bright, uncompromising Provençal as the festival approached. Richard made a choice. He would not allow the false narrative to reach the public. He would find a way to reveal the truth, even if it meant risking his career and his reputation. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and opposition, but for the first time in years, he felt a clarity of purpose. Watching Elodie laugh with children outside the bakery, Richard understood fully. Some stories were bigger than ambition, bigger than influence, bigger than fear. Some stories deserved honesty, even at the highest cost. The chill that settled over Provence the next morning mirrored the growing weight in Richard's chest. He moved through the streets with a sense of impending collision, knowing the window to stop the publication was rapidly closing. He awoke before dawn, restless, thinking about the letters he had drafted to his editor, the deadlines looming, and the growing unease that he could no longer postpone confronting the truth. Outside, the town stirred to life, the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the crisp air. Elodie moved gracefully through the bakery, kneading dough with quiet determination, unaware of the storm gathering far beyond these stone walls. By mid-morning, an email from Mr. Dupont shattered the quiet. The message was polite but carried the cold edge of a threat. The deadline was absolute, and any further delay would be seen as a breach of contract. Richard felt the pressure tightening like a physical grip, a reminder that the powerful machinery he served was now turning against him. The words were polite, almost cordial, yet carried an unmistakable weight. Deadlines were firm, contracts were binding, and delay would not be tolerated. Dupont's influence reached far beyond the town. Richard understood that he was a pawn in a much larger scheme, and any misstep could have consequences that extended well past the borders of Provence. He felt the pressure coiling within him, each email a reminder that inaction could destroy not only his career, but also the bakery he had grown to admire. Richard considered fleeing, retreating to the anonymity of New York, but each time he looked at Elodie, at the bakery, at the town, he felt the weight of his conscience. He could not abandon them. could not allow DuPont's plans to succeed unchallenged. Yet the editor, the gatekeeper of his words, had already signaled that the first draft of his article was scheduled for publication. Richard knew the power of the press and how quickly misinformation could spread, leaving the bakery vulnerable to public scorn, inspections, and eventual closure. The sense of urgency became a tangible presence, pressing down on his chest with each passing hour. Elodie, sensing his distraction, asked gently, "Are you all right, Richard? You've been distant all morning." He hesitated, searching for words that could convey the weight of his internal struggle without frightening her. "I'm thinking about work," he said finally, vague enough to avoid the truth yet honest enough not to lie outright. She nodded, understanding only partially, and returned to her tasks. Her focus and serenity were a stark contrast to his inner turmoil, highlighting the depth of his unease. The town's market that afternoon was bustling with activity. Richard followed Elodie through the stalls, observing her interactions, noting the genuine relationships she nurtured with each vendor. He watched as she selected ingredients with care, negotiating respectfully, appreciating quality over price. Each encounter reinforced the dissonance between the fabricated reports and the reality he witnessed firsthand. He began sketching mental notes, cataloging details, documenting practices that could counteract the falsehoods spreading through the documents. The responsibility he felt was immense. It was no longer simply a question of journalism, but of justice and truth. Back at the bakery, late afternoon shadows crept across the counters. Richard found himself drawn to the small office at the back, where files and receipts were kept. He glanced at the papers, thinking about the story he could have written, the narrative of decay and filth, and felt a wave of shame. The bakery's pristine records, meticulous logs, and careful accounting were a testament to honesty and dedication. His fingers brushed over the ledgers almost reverently, a silent acknowledgement that every entry contradicted the lies he had been handed. Mr. DuPont's pressure continued to escalate. Phone calls, urgent emails, veiled threats, all pointed to a singular goal: publication of the article that would ruin Elodie and clear the path for his development. Richard felt the tension coiling tighter, knowing that every moment of delay increased both his risk and the bakery's vulnerability. The internal conflict intensified: professional duty, personal ethics, emerging affection for Elodie, and fear of the powerful man pursuing his agenda all collided, leaving him exhausted and anxious. That evening, he remained in the bakery long after Elodie had closed up for the day. He pondered strategies, weighing options, considering the possible consequences of defiance. Every plan carried risk. Every delay could be fatal. Yet as he observed the town settling into the quiet of night, the warm glow of the bakery's windows spilling onto the street, he realized that no career achievement, no influence, no contract could outweigh the truth and the lives affected by its distortion. Finally, he made a decision. He would not allow the fabricated story to proceed unchallenged. He would fight, using whatever resources and wit he possessed to expose the deception, even if it meant losing everything he had built. And through it all, a new determination settled within him, one born not from ambition, but from respect, admiration, and a growing, undeniable care for Elodie, the bakery, and the community she cherished. The battle lines were drawn, and the first moves of an ethical war had begun in the quiet stone streets of Provence. As the investigation deepened, Richard transformed his rented room into a makeshift war room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of his laptop. He spent hours tracing the digital footprints of Mr. DuPont, uncovering a labyrinth of shell companies used to funnel consulting fees to the very inspectors who had signed the reports of noncompliance. He didn't just collect papers. He hunted for the cracks in the developer's facade. He secured signed affidavits from the local creamery and the stone mill, documents that turned Elodie's commitment to quality into legal armor. Late one night, he recorded a final, desperate call from his editor, who inadvertently confirmed that the dirty photos had been staged by a third-party contractor. The evidence was no longer just about bread. It was about a systematic dismantling of a town's soul for profit. However, the powerful machinery of the press, fueled by DuPont's influence, moved faster than Richard's conscience. Despite his desperate pleas to the editorial board to hold the story, The article was leaked to a subsidiary site, framed as a preliminary investigation that smelled of scandal. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The bakery was forced to close its doors for the day as the digital poison seeped into the stone streets of Provence. Townspeople whispered in shadows, their glances a mix of doubt and apprehension. Even longtime vendors began to hesitate, fearing that association with Elodie would tarnish their own reputations. Richard walked beside the silent bakery, watching the once lively square empty of its joy, the laughter of children replaced by muted murmurs and the cold, invisible reach of a lie he had helped set in motion. Elodie sat inside the bakery, her hands clasped tightly, staring at the empty shelves. Tears streaked her flour-dusted cheeks, her heart heavy with shock and disbelief. She had dedicated her life to her craft, to the town, to the community that had nurtured her family for generations. And now it seemed all that effort could be erased by a few words on a screen. How could they believe this? She whispered to no one, her voice trembling. Richard stood near the doorway, unable to offer comfort beyond the simple presence of apology and guilt, knowing words alone were inadequate to undo the damage. The next day brought inspections, officials questioning the bakery's practices. Even though the bakery was impeccable, the perception created by the article cast a shadow over every transaction, every loaf, every procedure. Residents hesitated to enter, wary of the supposed contamination described online. Richard watched as his worst fears materialized, the power of misinformation spreading faster than truth could travel. His chest ached with frustration and remorse. He had underestimated the velocity of public perception, the ease with which lies could disrupt a delicate ecosystem of trust and care. DuPont, sensing momentum, arrived in town with his usual charm and concealed malice. He approached Elodie with a proposal, smooth and calculated. "Sell me the land," he said, voice soft, but every syllable sharpened with intent. "It's the best option for everyone. You will be compensated, and I can guarantee stability for the town." Elodie recoiled, anger and disbelief flashing in her eyes. "Stability at the cost of lies and destruction? Never," she retorted. Richard felt a surge of protective indignation, his own resolve strengthening. DuPont's presence was a physical reminder that the stakes were higher than mere reputation. They were about survival, integrity, and the soul of the community. While the digital scandal continued to churn outside, Richard focused entirely on the dossiers he had compiled. He knew that the only way to silence DuPont was to present the truth as a weapon. He spent the remaining hours double-checking every timestamp and cross-referencing the financial records of the shell companies, ensuring there was no room for denial. Elodie, meanwhile, oscillated between despair and determination. The bakery was more than a business. It was a legacy. She spent hours meticulously documenting procedures, confirming supplier integrity, and preparing to present her case. Richard observed, heart heavy yet inspired by her resilience. The two worked in tandem silently, the urgency of necessity binding them together, even as the emotional strain weighed heavily. Their unspoken connection deepened, reinforced by mutual purpose and the shared struggle against an overwhelming force. By late afternoon, Richard had assembled a comprehensive dossier. He carried it to the bakery, placing it carefully on the counter outside Elodie's office. She looked at him, a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and reluctant hope in her gaze. "What is this?" she asked softly. "Proof. Everything you need to show them the truth," he replied, voice steady despite the whirlwind of anxiety inside him. "It's not enough for words alone. They need evidence, undeniable evidence." Elodie opened the folder, scanning the meticulously collected documents, her expression gradually shifting from doubt to determination. Richard stepped back, feeling the weight of anticipation. The next steps would be critical, the outcome uncertain, yet for the first time since the article's publication, hope flickered. The battle for truth had begun in earnest, and though the road ahead was perilous, he knew that together they could reclaim what had been threatened. The bakery, the town, and the fragile trust that connected them all depended on courage, persistence, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The weight of the evidence finally forced the authorities to act, as the official records and recorded conversations were placed in the hands of independent investigators, rendering the falsified reports officially voided. Richard spent the evening with Elodie in the quiet back of the bakery, no longer as a critic, but as a silent witness to the resilience of a legacy that had almost been extinguished. The atmosphere between them had shifted. The silence was no longer heavy with the tension of betrayal, but filled with the peace of a storm that had finally passed, leaving the foundation of the bakery stronger and more certain than it had ever been. The impact of the independent investigation was immediate and undeniable, sweeping through the town with the force of a long-awaited rain. As the sun climbed over the stone rooftops, the community's response shifted from suspicion to a collective reclamation of their heritage, as if the truth had finally broken the spell of DuPont's influence. The local authorities, presented with the incontrovertible metadata and recordings Richard had meticulously prepared, officially cleared the bakery of all allegations, while DuPont's web of shell companies became the subject of a state-level inquiry. Inside the bakery, the tension that had suffocated Elodie for weeks finally dissolved, replaced by the rhythmic, healing work of her craft. She moved with a newfound lightness, her hands once again finding the familiar, steady beat of kneading dough, knowing that her sanctuary was once again secure. Several months passed before life in the Provençal town fully returned to its familiar rhythm. The lavender fields bloomed again under the wide summer sky, their purple waves stretching toward the hills as if the land itself had chosen to forget the tension that once shadowed the village. The scandal that had threatened to destroy Elodie's bakery slowly transformed into a story of resistance and truth. Newspapers that had once repeated DuPont's accusations now published quiet follow-up pieces describing the investigation, the falsified documents, and the legal consequences that followed. DuPont's company withdrew its development proposal entirely, and not long afterward the man himself disappeared from the region, his reputation damaged far beyond this single town. The bakery reopened fully at the beginning of spring. The first morning after the reopening, a long line formed outside the small wooden door even before sunrise. Farmers arrived with fresh ingredients, neighbors brought flowers, and travelers who had heard about the scandal stopped by out of curiosity that quickly turned into admiration. Inside, Elodie worked with renewed focus, shaping dough with the same patient precision her grandfather had once taught her. Nothing about her methods had changed, yet the meaning behind every loaf now carried deeper significance. The bakery had survived not just through tradition, but through resilience. The town itself seemed proud of that survival. The square regained its lively energy, children chasing pigeons across the stones, elderly couples sharing morning coffee at outdoor tables, and vendors setting up colorful stalls during market days. Visitors often asked about the bakery mentioned in the investigation articles, and residents happily pointed them toward the small building with the faded sign that read Boulangerie de la Famille. Over time, the bakery became something more than a place to buy bread. It became a quiet symbol of how a community could defend itself when truth was threatened. Richard did not remain in New York. After publicly opposing the publication that had printed the false article, his position as a critic had effectively ended. For a while he traveled between cities working as an independent writer, publishing essays about food, culture, and the ethics of journalism. His audience was smaller than before, but the readers who followed his work trusted him in a way that reputation alone had never achieved. The scandal in Provence had changed him profoundly. Instead of writing from a distance, he now focused on stories rooted in people and the communities that shaped them. One warm afternoon in late summer, Richard returned to the town once more. The journey felt different this time. When he had first arrived months earlier, he had come carrying a camera and a set of documents that almost destroyed the place. Now he arrived with nothing but a small travel bag and a quiet hope that the past had not permanently closed the door between him and the person he had hurt most. The bakery looked exactly as he remembered. The wooden shutters were open, sunlight filled the windows, and the smell of warm croissants drifted into the street. For a moment he simply stood there, watching the familiar scene. Customers laughing softly inside, a basket of fresh baguettes cooling near the counter, and Elodie moving calmly through the bakery with flour dusting her hands. When she noticed him in the doorway, she paused. Time seemed to slow in that brief moment of recognition. The last months had given her distance from the anger she once felt, yet the memory of everything that had happened remained vivid. Richard stepped inside slowly. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he admitted. Elodie studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than guarded. The man standing before her was not the same person who had first walked into the bakery with quiet skepticism months earlier. The struggle they had faced had changed both of them. "You helped expose the truth," she said. "Without that, none of this would still be here." Richard looked around the bakery, the warm light reflecting from the wooden shelves. "I only fixed a mistake that should never have happened." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elodie reached behind the counter and placed a freshly baked croissant on a small plate in front of him. "Try it," she said with a faint smile. "Tell me if the recipe still meets the standards of a former critic." Richard laughed softly, the tension that had followed him into the bakery finally easing. He took a bite, recognizing instantly the same flavor that had first unsettled his certainty months earlier: butter, warmth, and something impossible to replicate outside this small town. When he looked up again, Elodie was watching him with quiet amusement. "So," she asked. "It's still perfect," he said. Outside, the evening sun settled gently over the Provençal rooftops, and the town moved through its familiar rhythms once again. The bakery remained exactly what it had always been, a place where people gathered, where bread was made with care, and where a story that had nearly ended in ruin found the chance to begin again.